Hello everyone, I hope you can hear me and see our screens, and welcome to the second part of the Art of CyberWar. My name is Jake Moore. I'm a cybersecurity specialist at ESET, and today I have the great privilege of introducing Rob Black, who's going to be talking to you about his current job, his past, and his future ideas in this huge war against cyber. But first of all, if I can just give you a quick background into this whole series we're hosting. We've got a few in this series which are looking extremely exciting. We've had Jeff White, and if you were around a couple of weeks ago, talking about his issues, trying to get into, well, finding out about Sony and the big hack then, and now we've got Rob Black here today. And now Rob, it's lovely to actually meet him finally today. I've been following him through a common ground in our network of SASIG, which we're both a part of, and he's got an amazing title. He's the Deputy Director of the UK National Cyber Deception Laboratory. Now that's a bit of a tongue twister for me, but it does sound rather interesting, and I can't wait to hear more from him. In fact, I've actually been lucky enough to hear the story today that he's going to be sharing with us, which is very, very interesting. So please think up some questions and fire them into the questions box. And I will be asking him any of your questions at the end of his session, which will be around 20 to 3. So I'll come back on and ask those questions to him. Now, we have got some other events coming up over the next couple of years, next couple of weeks even. We have on the 18th of November, we've got episode 2 of Jeff White's escapades. This one's talking about the Bangladesh bank. And then on the 15th of December, just before the end of the year, we are going to have episode 3 from him, which is the Bank of Valletta, and all about money laundering, which is, with my past working in the police force and investigating money laundering, is one of the ones that I'm particularly interested in, because I'm always interested to know how these criminals are getting away with their offences, and hopefully at the same time we can then learn how to interact and stop those offences from attacking us. Now that takes me nicely over to my colleague Steve. Just before we go into Rob and what he has to say, Steve Connolly is going to talk us through a bit more about ESET and what we have to offer. So take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Jake. Thanks very much. So yeah, I'm Steve Connolly. I'm the Head of Enterprise Marketing here at ESET UK. So good afternoon and welcome to the second in ESET's The Art of CyberWar series of webinars. So I'm not going to take too much of your time up before we introduce you to the reason why you're here today, which is to listen to Rob Black, who, as we've said, is Deputy Director of the UK National Cyber Deception Lab. And he'll be speaking about bringing military deception techniques back into IT security. I'm interested to know about bringing it back in, but I'm sure that Rob will actually explain further. I want to just take a few minutes, though, just to bring you up to speed with ESET and why we're running these fascinating, we hope, thought-provoking sessions. But firstly, who is ESET? I think we got quite a wide range of attendees today. We've got some channel partners on here, some people who we already provide services for, and some people who've never really, maybe not interacted with us in the near past. So I just wanted to just run you through quickly who we are, and I'll keep this as relevant and succinct as possible. As I say, I don't want to be too much of a barrier between the beginning of this and Rob. So first of all, who is ESET? So we're a digital security company. We used to be antivirus. We were then anti-malware, but now we're digital security. And that really reflects the expansion or proliferation of attack vectors that we've seen over the years, but also the attack surfaces as we as a, as organizations, as people actually embraced all the good things that internet-based and e-commerce has brought to our global economy. We've been 30 years in the industry. The first iteration of the kernel of our endpoint protection was what I think is the legendary Nod 32, was created back in 1987 in Slovakia, in Bratislava, in fact. And the people who created that, typically, they created it in a bedroom, of course they did. Those people are still actually the owners of the company. So 30 odd years later, we're a privately owned company, and the people who started it are still there. Interestingly, we're the largest European-based IT security company of our type, so endpoint protection, and we're the fourth largest company of our type in the world. And we protect, conservatively, directly, this is around 110 million endpoints worldwide, and indirectly, somewhere north of 600 million, and that's through the daily users of Google, for whom we actually provide app scanning and the Chrome cleanup solution for Google. In addition, we're present in around 200 countries worldwide. We've got 18 R&D centers and local and regional offices around the world. So the sun never really sets on ESET as such. Again, north of 2,000 employees, and approximately 40% of our employees are directly involved in the research and development of both researching the new threats that are actually emerging and also developing solutions to actually combat those. We've also got a wide portfolio there for a protection solution. So we protect consumers as well. So we've got a consumer range, but all the way up to, as we've mentioned, the Googles of the world, large enterprise. So as I like to say, we protect everybody from Granny to Google, effectively. With, as I say, our legendary Nod 32 at the kernel of the endpoint protection we provide. What many people are probably less aware of, including those that work with us or that we provide services for, though, are our wider connections with intelligence agencies around the globe. We provide threat intelligence reporting and threat intelligence information to and work closely with, in fact, organizations such as the NCSC, GCHQ, FBI, CIA, and a load of other acronyms, Interpol, Europol, and others, about organized criminal gangs, malicious nation-state actors, pretty much almost on a daily basis, to be fair. It's also fair to say, therefore, that we could be looked at as a threat intelligence-based company. This intelligence helps us to create solutions and services to stay ahead of these threats and help protect individuals and organizations from malicious and damaging activities. So the threat reports and intel feeds are becoming more and more important to a wider range of organizations directly. And this is an area of expertise ESET is also able to offer. Of course, there are practical solutions that we provide. Our services, solutions, and products have evolved over time to become multi-layered, and I'll just put a pin in multi-layered, to combat the proliferation of attack vectors exploited by what we see as increasingly sophisticated cyber criminal activities. So the threat reports and intel feeds are part of a wider portfolio of solutions, and it's important that they are delivered by experts in the area. From your perspective, it's important that they're delivered by experts. As I said, ESET is just that. We are expert in this area. So to the Art of CyberWar webinar series, really. Where does all this fit? Why Rob's talk? I hear you ask these questions. To answer those, I'll just say this. We believe that by understanding how certain breaches occurred, for example, we heard in the first of our series from Jeff White, for those of you who actually tuned in for that one, how Sony was nearly brought to its knees due to just an innocuous email and somebody clicking on that. But we hope to help you understand how to prevent such occurrences in the future and add a further layer to your multi-layered defenses. And in this case, that extra layer is knowledge, and also the history of what's actually occurred in the past. It could be argued that knowing more about your adversaries, well, our adversaries, I guess, is as important as deploying the right solutions to protect you from them. And this is really what the Art of CyberWar is trying to address. So Rob is about to give you food for thought about another potential layer of defense in this multi-layered approach, and that is deception, and a more proactive posture potentially when it comes to cybersecurity. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a fascinating area. I've had the privilege of seeing Rob's presentation already. I'm sure you'll find it useful as you think about your future strategy as much as your current strategies. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rob and the main event. Hi, Rob. I've already mentioned who you are, but please introduce yourself. Tell us more about how you believe military strategies might be considered to improve our security in cyberspace.
Oh, hi there, Steve and Jake. Thanks very much for hosting me today. Hopefully you can see my slides and they've all, the wonders of technology have all worked, so it's all good to go. And it's a real pleasure to come and share the thoughts of my colleagues and myself in the lab. And I guess I'll start off by saying that this is very much a brief intended to offer us an opportunity to reflect on some of our assumptions and to see if there were ways to revisit these assumptions to make sure we're taking the right approach to the current fight we're in. And I do genuinely believe we're in a fight, and sometimes it's easy to lose track of that when we're worrying about assurance and paperwork and everything else. So the aspiration for this talk is, and as you've mentioned, it's been seen before, is just to use this as an opportunity for you and the audience to reflect on and consider where do you position yourself and how do you approach the problem that we call cybersecurity. So I trust it will be an interesting talk. And I look forward to the questions afterwards and following up and hopefully having you guys engaged with the lab more broadly in the future. So I'm just going to jump through slides and hope that they all work. Bear with me. A little bit of background about myself, as Steve requested. So yeah, I'm the Deputy Director of the National Cyber Deception Lab, which is championed by the Ministry of Defence and administered by Cranfield University. And our focus is about being the nexus for proactive cyber defence. And using deception at the heart of that proactive cyber defense. So we have a series of stakeholders across government and the military. We also have technical partners from the deception tech world, but also the digital intelligence world. And we have research partners across academia, both within the UK and more broadly located across the globe as well. Separate to that, my role and day job is a lecturer at the UK Defence Academy, where I spend my time teaching UK military personnel to think about cybersecurity with respect to their operational activities, both in terms of ensuring that they can act in the way that they need to when we need them to act, but also how they need to think about incorporating cyber into this new age of operational activities that we find ourselves in. And I'm also director of the UK Cyber 912 Strategy Challenge, which is the competition aimed at empowering the next generation of cybersecurity professionals who can bring a strategy and policy perspective alongside the technical perspective to dealing with national cybersecurity crises. Prior to coming to the Defence Academy and my role at Cranfield University and with the National Cyber Deception Lab, I was a civil servant. I was working within the MOD, and I spent a lot of the time focusing on, first of all, focusing on how we can improve the way we fight wars better by including the option of understanding how we can influence the decision making of our adversaries. And then from about 2010, 2011, I woke up to this thing called the internet, and it was changing our lives. And I realized it was going to have an effect on how we fought wars in the future and how we as a society engaged with each other in the future. And I spent more of my time then focusing on how does cyber situate and how do we bring human sciences through to cyber as we situate cyber as a national security tool or as a weapon of warfare and defending against that as well. So it's from that perspective that I present these thoughts today. And I say, just as a sort of initial caveat, these very much are my own and some of the discussions we've had within the team, rather necessarily representative of the MOD or Cranfield University. So if there's any problems, please come back to me directly. So another caveat I want to touch on before we start is that this is very much the argument that we present to the UK military personnel who are involved with the National Cyber Deception Lab. They have a potentially unique situation that they find themselves in, and they are responsible for protecting the UK and our sovereign territory. And they're responsible for being able to use force as and when it's needed. So they have to be absolutely confident they have taken the necessary steps to protect their digital territory from hostile intruders or attackers. And it's that challenge that we present to them to say, how is the best way to achieve this and what should we be doing? And I would argue and consider that whether or not their unique position of being able to wield force might be something that you as individuals in the audience might not necessarily have that lever of power, but you still have the responsibility to protect your digital territory and ask the questions as to how you can best go about achieving that. To achieve that in this talk, I'm really going to focus on two areas, and hopefully you'll understand why. First of all, I'm going to revisit and look at what does it mean to live in today's age, in today's age of cyber and the information age that we find ourselves in? And let's look at some of the fundamental assumptions we find ourselves dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And then once we've looked at those assumptions, let's think about what that means for conducting cyber defense. And I say cyber defense rather than cyber security because I do believe there is a significant difference in terms of approach and philosophy behind it. So focusing on the implications of living in the age of cyber and the world we find ourselves in, it's without doubt we've heard military generals, we've heard world leaders make proclamations and announcements about the fact that society has changed and we are now in the information age and we're now in this virtual cyber existence. And you can think about various different scenarios or situations where that's come to the fore. But what I want to do first of all is focus on some of the military doctrine and thinking and the more traditional industry thinking on cybersecurity and cyber defense. So if I present this picture to you, this is a relatively standard model of cybersecurity that you'll see. You'll see the NIST life cycle down at the bottom, which is the kind of recognized standards in the US, and they break up cybersecurity against sort of 4 key areas: the identify, the protect, 5 key areas rather: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And these overlap with the standard operating model that we're seeing in the UK military when thinking about cybersecurity and cyber defense. Defensive cyber operations are those operations that secure the freedom of maneuver in cyberspace, but are normally undertaken within an information assurance framework. And you can see within that framework that there are a range of different areas. The traditional standard cybersecurity, where the core function is to protect our devices and networks and the services that we access away from and avoid any theft or damage. But then we've got the more focused incident management, including incident response, which is very much at that developing a well-planned, systematic approach to addressing or managing a reaction to a cyber attack or a network security breach. And the focus there is to minimize damage, reduce disaster recovery time, and start enabling the fact that we can bounce back to our normal operations. And that brings in cyber resilience. And the best way of defining cyber resilience is the bounce back ability, measures that we can put in place to allow an organization to withstand or recover from and bounce back from a malicious event that might be caused to them. The only time we start being tailored to understanding our adversaries or thinking about our adversaries is when we move into the concept of active and passive defense. And the idea of active defense being those activities that target hostile offensive cyber operations in order to allow us and to preserve our freedom of maneuver in cyberspace. And you'll see a range of activities that the NCSC are doing with regards to active defense to take down like large-scale spear phishing efforts or large-scale cyber attack capabilities. But then we also have the more, I guess, focused passive defense, where we've got an understanding of particular threats and we've taken those specific measures in our defense efforts so that we can reduce the effectiveness of certain activities. And this is where I think the majority of the digital intelligence and the threat intelligence work is focused on. We learn who the bad guys are, or we learn what their behaviors are and their TTPs, and then we share that almost in a crowdsourced model with our customers and with our broader community so that we can help them build the walls up of their defenses that little bit better. And if you think about it, it's very much a kind of protect my castle and stop the bad guys getting inside. And only when we start dealing with incident management do we do sweeping up when they're inside. Now, this is the standard model. This is very much a lock and key approach to cybersecurity. But the question then becomes, if this is a lock and key approach, where is the response should that lock and key model not work? Where is the response when our crown jewels are absolutely compromised and our critical competitive advantage or information and data has been stolen? If we are in a fight, and if we are in a world where we are seeing fighting occurring on an increasing basis with a number of cyber attacks taking place on a daily basis increasing, then surely we need to start expecting incoming, and we need to start considering that will be occasions where there will be unavoidable but necessary collateral damage. And where does our strategy of cybersecurity accommodate for that? I don't see it in the standard lock and key model, and I don't see it in the standard defensive cyber operational model that I present to you. So if I take this model forward and plot it in terms of where we're situating our thinking here, you'll see the standard cybersecurity model is a threat-informed security posture. Very much measures we take in our networks to defend ourselves against the incoming cyber attacks. And automatically we rule out the option of hackback, the activities that we might do in their networks. But I think this is a rather binary and perhaps polar view on the reality we find ourselves in. There is in fact a huge amount more activity that we could be doing in our networks to engage with and interact with our attackers as they are thinking about conducting operations against us, which would be a proactive cyber defense effort, which I think most importantly more accurately realizes the implications of the time that we live in, rather than the traditional passive threat-informed defense, which relies on that lock and key model. So I would argue proactive cyber defense moves beyond the traditional thinking and the traditional passive civilianized approach to cybersecurity and intelligence-led information assurance. Now, I'm not encouraging that we should be moving straight into their networks and the attackers' networks and conducting hackback operations left, right, and center. But what I'm encouraging is a debate about where does hackback start and what can we do within our own networks. And this is where I think it's really important to reflect on those assumptions. So if we think about the age of cyber warfare that we find ourselves in, we can recognize that cyber has become the modern day battlefield, not only between nation states, but between sub-state actors and nation states. We've seen, as you heard reflected on the previous seminar, was an attack against Sony Pictures, a multinational organization that included a response up to President Obama taking the stage. These are without doubt new and unprecedented times. And the governments and our militaries are still trying to work out what cyber is and how we should be using cyber as an integrated part of our statecraft and our military activity. And we're seeing with certain activities around the world that sub-threshold warfare without the warfighting, is becoming the norm. So what does that really mean in terms of what the age of cyber means to us as individuals? Well, we recognize that we need to defend against the unprecedented. The Chief of the Defense Staff of the military has recognized we're facing new operational realities and effects that can't necessarily be grasped by the traditional models of warfare that we usually use. Yet at the same time, the old operational realities still continue to exist. So we are still in a situation where there is combatant versus combatant, still in an adversarial setup, but they've got novel aims. They've got novel ways of achieving the goals and their objectives. And also in this new age of cyber, the fundamentals of time and space and physicality no longer apply like they used to. So rather than see it as a discrete set of missile attacks between two nation states on different continents, perhaps we need to consider this as more of a perpetual knife fight and an intimate engagement between two people, between the two digital proxies of the combatants themselves. And then what would that mean for how we take on our cybersecurity posture? The other challenge that we're finding ourselves in with the increasing number of attacks and the ease with which some of these attacks are occurring is that we are probably in a situation where we're facing the reality of a likely defeat in the defense of our home territory. Cybersecurity is an existential threat to us. Organizations can fall if we don't get our cybersecurity models right. But the question is, have we already lost that battle for our home territory, of our digital networks in particular? If the median dwell time is approximately 70 to 80 days, and in worst cases scenarios can be up to several years, and if we think of the recent SolarWinds incidents or the Chinese access to Microsoft Exchange, are we not in a situation where we have already likely to have lost our next war of national survival before we've even fired a shot? Have we already lost that battle for our home territory of our information networks? If so, and if our systems are overrun already and our supply chains are compromised, then we actually have no rear area from which we can launch our own supply and delivery of our capabilities and control our digitally dependent weapon systems. So we have no trusted ground from which we can operate. We would actually be fighting our enemy in an occupied home territory scenario. So what would this mean for our concept of operations? What would this mean if we couldn't trust the very digital tools that we were using? If we couldn't trust the fighter jet that we were about to launch, or that we would have confidence on the missile being launched when we really needed it to launch? So if we are defending against the unprecedented, if there is a real reality or a real likelihood of defeat, the reality is there's a real likelihood of defeat of our home territory, then we need to think about changing the rules of combat. We need to think about how we're engaging with our adversaries, and we need to face the fact that there might be costs and sacrifices that we need to take and that cannot be avoided in our attempts to fight back to win and to win our home territory. The cyber defense of our military networks in particular need to be militarized, and perhaps the cyber defense of our other networks need to be militarized too. Military cyber defense is currently understandably dominated by the passive civilian approaches of security. The fundamental principles of security in the space is a threat intelligence driven model where we gain that intelligence, we share it with our partners in order to build those walls up a little bit more and to not let anyone in. The traditional lock and key model to securing our assets, to securing not only our assets but what we value. But this only works that when we respond to the violations that occur, and those violations are met with a response. The question is, what is that response in cyberspace? When this happens in society, the state turns to the military and individuals turn to the state. So it is the state alone that is responsible to back up our security with its willingness to fight for it. It is the role of the armed forces in this and our military to make that fight and to make the necessary sacrifices and difficult decisions in having that fight. The military profoundly understand the use of aggression and the use of violence within combat. They're also the only legitimate authority to do this. They also have the unique burden of understanding what it takes to wield lethal capability, and they have the moral courage to put themselves in harm's way and to make difficult decisions which might cause their own colleagues to be injured or hurt, or the collateral damage that might include the injury to civilians in order to achieve the necessary military objectives. This is standard military thinking and training for warfighting. As a state and as individuals of the state, we trust them to defend our society and to make those difficult decisions, putting themselves in harm's way. And I guess it's appropriate that this week we're leading up to Remembrance Sunday and we think about the sacrifices people have made. And people have been willing to make those sacrifices to protect themselves, their colleagues, and their nation. They take those decisions and they pursue those actions knowing that there will be unavoidable collateral damage and potential costs. But fighting for and winning the battle is the fundamental purpose that defines their existence. Their entire organization, structure, and culture is designed around this very fact of the mission, except when we turn to cyber defense. When we turn to cyber defense, we almost automatically hand it over to a civilian mindset. And these civilianized models of cyber defense rejects this most fundamental aspect of combat and conflict. And that is people are going to get hurt, and that might include the very people doing the defending. And there might be collateral damage to this fight. We need to think about what that looks like in cyber security and in our defense of our cyber networks. The military need, and our military networks need, a full spectrum military defense of their networks. And it leads you to ask the questions, where are the comparisons? Where are the parallels that we can use? Where are the parallels that we can take forward to this new age of warfare? Now, if I'm talking about deception and I talk about World War II, most people refer to Operation Mincemeat and the use of a dead body to throw off the German plans about where the Allies were going to invade. But I want to choose a different example. This example was from 1940. This was where the UK was facing an expected Nazi invasion. Churchill recognized the need to take action. And he tasked this individual, Colonel Gubbins, later to become Brigadier Gubbins, to defend against this existential threat of the Nazi invasion. We had seen the Nazi forces speed their way with the mechanized blitzkrieg technique, a new technique, through Western Europe, destroying the defenses. It was so effective that mainland European defenses pretty much stood no chance, were next to useless. So the defense of the UK had to be done differently. This was about our national survival, and this level of desperation required a different and potentially unorthodox response in order to stave off complete defeat. Now, Gubbins wasn't a specialist in building fortifications, nor was he a specialist or a commander known for his ability to conduct large-scale battle formations. Instead, he was an expert in guerrilla warfare. He oversaw the formulation of the auxiliary units which were positioned around the south coast of the UK. And these were irregular fighters drawn from local communities who didn't participate in the conventional standard defense of our towns. Their role began when that defense had already failed and they had been overrun. And the objective of the auxiliary units was to inflict as much mayhem as possible, mayhem and disruption as possible, over a brief but intensely violent period. Their service was expected to be highly dangerous, with just a projected life expectancy of 12 days. But this plan for national survival in 1940, I think, has considerable overlaps with today's cyber-enabled conflict. There is an active front in a war for our home territory. They had to do an aggressive defense of their home territory as a legitimate part of their fight for national survival, where the use of violence is legally possible. They needed to defend against the unprecedented, the Nazi blitzkrieg techniques. There was a real likelihood that we wouldn't survive and that we would be defeated in defense of our home territory. And as a result, they needed to change the way we conducted wars to think about using different tactics and techniques in order that we could inflict the necessary cost and damage to disrupt the threat. But we also had to appreciate that we might well need to absorb and face costs and sacrifices in doing so in order to fight back and defend our territory. And I think these parallels are really relevant with where we are today. So if we think about that, we think about the work that Gubbins did and the approach he took. He recognized that we needed to focus on both the physical and the psychological aspects of those attacking us. And I think the same is true today. We've got the digital aspects, we've got the physical aspects and the psychological aspects. Perhaps less so with the physical, but the majority of our cybersecurity model is bound in defining our threat actors based on their digital entities and their digital components. We don't think about the psychological dimensions of those attacking us, and yet we could. And I think this comes into how we go about redefining our defense of our networks. And this is very much where we're focusing on the work in the National Cyber Deception Lab. Because I think if you ask yourself the question, how should we fight in this unprecedented operational environment? One perspective that we could offer, or that you could offer, is that we could start by actively defending our home networks in exactly the same way the auxiliary units did back in World War II. And this would mean attacking the digital and psychological and potentially physical aspects and dimensions of those that are attacking us. Now, we have rules of engagement that allow troops to defend themselves if they come under direct fire. This retaliation can often occur and is necessary to occur before any attribution investigations or forensic investigations take place to identify who is shooting at them. Yet this is never the case in cyber. The costs of this capability and the choices that it might bring are understood within a broader framework of values that are rooted in centuries of experience of conflict. But yet one consistent feature of this operational activity that has survived years, and we're talking about the art of war, which has taken from Sun Tzu from thousands of years ago, is the use of deception. And this has been deployed in society throughout the ages. Deception is used by predators and prey. It is used by attackers and defenders. It offers a competitive and evolutionary advantage to those that use it. And that can be seen from the entirety of life on our planet, from the microbial all the way through to the geopolitical stage of nation-state actors. So our aspiration in the lab is to explore whether deception offers us this vital opportunity within this new and unprecedented operational space of the cyber environment. If throughout history it has provided us an opportunity to level the playing field between the attacker and the defender, between the strong and the weak, why would it not necessarily apply today in today's modern environment? So deception has offered us a tool set to engage with our cyber-enabled adversaries that bombs and bullets in the physical dimension might not necessarily allow. It provides us fundamentally with a way to fight when our digital rear areas of our networks are already overrun. And I would argue that this is the case whether you believe it to be the situation now or you accept it is likely to happen in the future. So what does it mean when thinking about how do we fight with deception? Well, deception is all about creating errors in the sense making of our adversaries. And sense making is that executive process of information, or that executive processing of information to generate action and behavior. So simply stated, it means what's going on, what does this mean, and what should I do about it? So the purpose of deception is to get them to enact in a way that suits their purpose, suits our purposes, not theirs. Traditionally, this cognitive attack surface is well understood by military commanders. However, in today's environment, which extends into the synthetic and the virtual elements of our cyber networks and our information systems, there is even more opportunity to use deception than ever before. We can see the elements of cyber warfare as pretty much a proxy battle between combatants. We need to have the ability to strike at the sense-making of both our attackers and the sense-making of their tools and the systems they deploy against us. We really need to revisit and reframe this cyber adversarial relationship. Move away from seeing cyber as a standoff, a geospatial standoff between discrete nation states firing missiles at each other, but to see cyber as a constant engagement and a multitude of intimate actions, feints and punches, knife fights here and there, disabling strikes from one side, and the stimulation of our adversaries through the cyber environment. We would argue that soon cyber deception is going to be a central component of an inevitable arms race. But this arms race isn't going to be won by the way that cyber seems to be being conducted at the moment, with the stockpiling of capabilities and zero days, with the threatening their releases over time. This is because we have no defensible rear area to hide these stockpiles in. We have no confidence that these stockpiles haven't already been exploited, and we've seen instances of those hacking tools being acquired and stolen and leaked by other actors already. So if we're in a situation where we have no defensible rear area, we will need to see that cyber deception will be a capability that will be being constantly developed, used, spent, and reused again. And this will lead us to a situation where cyber deception will be expected. It won't be a surprise, and this in itself isn't a weakness. Our attackers knowing that we're using cyber deception will not mean that we've given the game away. It will mean that they will start expecting deception, and actually as a result, this means they'll start anticipating feints and sleights of hand left, right, and center, and they'll start questioning everything. The enemy's expectation of deception in warfighting goes back the same as warfighting itself throughout history. And this expectation itself can be manipulated to achieve positive proactive effects in the defense of our networks. So for those seeking to attack our future military networks, nothing will be what it seems. There will be no aspect of a network combat infrastructure, whether it be a deployed headquarters, whether it be a naval frigate, a bomber, or the latest aircraft carrier, which will not carry deception assets. And there will be a huge amount of potential to displace, disrupt, and even deliver a reciprocal strike back at the attacker. But what does this mean for cybersecurity when we're looking at redefining the cyber defense mindset? How can we bring this military sense of maneuver back into cybersecurity? Well, this then becomes about an applied level, tactical level focus of deterrence. We acknowledge that deterrence rests on the decision-making processes of our attackers, reliance on their reliance and their perceptions of the situation, their beliefs, not necessarily the objects of the environment. If they can believe that they're being threatened, they will act differently as a result. And actually, this presents us with an opportunity to make them believe that there is a guardian present in our networks that might cause consequence to them and who might cause them to get hurt if they proceed with an action against us. This is a very different way of engaging our attackers than we're currently doing. If they recognize that there are consequences to their actions or sanctions imposed in response or in anticipation of their actions, then we definitely have a psychological component to exploit. And if we have a psychological component to exploit, they are walking into our cyber booby traps. And if you think about what those cyber booby traps might look like, I can give you a couple of examples. Deception will no longer relate to just the tools and techniques that are currently being used to honeypot our attackers so we can study and learn from them. And at best gain a knowledge of their techniques so we can build our walls up and protect them better. It will no longer be about having a highly camouflaged sensor detecting adversary movement in our networks. Deception will then become about disrupting their sense-making and undermining their trust in the outcomes of the operation, just like we saw in 1982 when the CIA disrupted the Soviet operation, the Line X operations, which was acquiring and stealing lots of data from research communities across the US. The first time the Soviets knew something was going wrong was when a pipeline exploded in Siberia. This led them to call into question everything they had stolen. They had realized their operation had been compromised, and they now no longer knew what was real and what was false. They had to put effort, they had to put resource into working out what information was valid and what information was nugatory, void, or even potentially damaging. But they only realized this when the pipeline went bang, and then they had to work through everything they had taken so far. But we've also seen techniques being used offensively that we could use defensively in our networks. How can we use our attackers to question the very tools they're using? Or better still, believe those tools when they're relaying false information about their network or about our networks to them. Think about Stuxnet in 2010, the famous cyber weapon. One of the clever bits of the Stuxnet tool was that when the centrifuges being spun at the Iranian nuclear enrichment plant, when they were being spun at the wrong speeds, causing them to be damaged, the information being portrayed back to the scientists was that the centrifuges were running at the right speed. So the scientists didn't do anything about it and chalked up the first few damaged, broken centrifuges as just operational errors. What would be the same of doing that to our attackers with their tooling being used against us? How could we get them to receive false information in the systems that they're responding to? It's all possible because we own the environment. And then thinking about the shadow brokers in 2016, we can use the techniques that we have employed to disrupt terrorist organizations or to disrupt the effective working between groups. We can get them to doubt each other, to question their own capabilities, to question their own decision-making processes. The shadow brokers in 2016 leaked a series of stolen NSA tools, hacking tools. And as they did that leaking and publicized that leaking, they also called out a series of cybersecurity practitioners on Twitter, in other parts of the online media, and highlighted how they were former NSA hackers. The individuals who were called out soon became fearful for their lives. They were unprepared to travel because they didn't know where shadow brokers came from and which state they were involved with. And they couldn't be certain they wouldn't be extradited from wherever they went traveling. They moved their families into hiding because they didn't know how much the shadow brokers knew about them. And we've seen similar things with Revil in recent weeks, when we've seen individuals from the Revil ransomware groups shut down networks and decide they're giving up the game because they're feeling persecuted and being followed by the authorities as they've come and taken down their servers and highlighted to them that they're actually after them. This is attacking the psychological component of our attackers as they move towards operations against us. What if we were to announce publicly that deception assets were deployed on our networks and were being used to defend the networks aggressively? How would that shape an attacker's expectation of what was going on? Would that not be similar to the burglar alarm on the side of the house? The NSA have done studies that show if you tell an attacker that there might be deception being deployed, they spend longer checking certain assets to see if they are decoys or not. And they don't touch some assets because they look too fake, they look too good to be true, and they generally question everything more. And that is even the case, even if there are no deception assets deployed. You're just simply telling them that deception is being deployed. We think nothing of advertising our force protection capabilities to deter attackers having a go at us when they see our military kit. In the physical and kinetic domain, this is the standard norms. We put guns on the side of our ships and make them obvious. So why wouldn't we be doing the same in cyberspace? We put little black boxes in the front of armored vehicles to protect against electromagnetic threats. And sometimes these boxes are just there to confuse the enemy's decision-making when we haven't got enough of those electronic countermeasures to put inside them. But the adversary doesn't know if we've got them or not then. So what would be the equivalent of doing this in cyberspace? How do we get the enemy to question absolutely everything, to question what they're doing in terms of attacking our networks, to make them think about this even before they've entered into our domain? In the future, with deception being ubiquitous, the assumption will be that every asset will be part of some deceptive strategy, or will have some deceptive defense integrated within it. If this is the case, this will be a much more attritional approach to cybersecurity, much more aggressive and attritional than the standard lock and key model that we're currently employing. And it will be no longer about building those fortifications and not letting the bad guys in. It'll be about anticipating their assault, expecting the incoming. It'll be about layering a defensive posture and building the fortifications necessary to affect and shape the adversary as they engage with us. It will be about deploying burnable defensive capabilities used to get the adversary to change their mind and act differently as they're conducting their operations, rather than necessarily just having an offensive capability to be used as a counter-strike after the event. In an age when it's not about kinetic anymore, in an age when the domain that we're fighting in is completely artificial and man-made, where the fundamental principles of time, space, and geography, and even physicality no longer apply, the only way we have to achieve an effect is through the manipulation of our attackers' understanding of what's going on, through their sense making, and that is through the art of deception. This, I believe, is the future of cybersecurity and cyber defense. So it leaves me with the question that if we're talking to the MOD, it's very much an emotional sell. No one else is coming to help you or protect you. You are the last line of defense for your nation. You have to take the necessary measures to defend yourselves and to make sure you've defended your networks for when you need to defend yourselves properly. But doesn't the same also apply to the civilian world too? There is no MOD or no cyber armor being deployed to protect you against a cyber attack. So who is going to protect you? Who is going to help? And I guess this is the perspective we're offering the MOD and in dealing with the challenges they face. I'd generally love to hear your thoughts as to how similar this might feel to you as private sector organizations, or whether this is inconsistent with the approach and the operating space that you find yourself working in. But fundamentally, I believe that if you're in a commercial organization, no one else is going to come and help you. There is no law and order to protect you in cyberspace. You can't just lock the door because we know that model doesn't work. You have to think about how you're going to fight. And you have to rely on some form of private justice in order to achieve that fight. And that's very much where we would argue that the justice can be enabled through shaping the adversary's decision-making and sense-making, which is deception. A couple of comments to finish up. We're running a symposium on the 7th of December, so should you want to come along, it's an online event. So hopefully there'll be some fascinating talks from around the globe with people that we've been working with thinking about these issues. So do feel free to sign up, and I'll pass details to Steve and Jake should anyone be interested in that as well. And likewise, should you wish to be involved with the Cyber Deception Lab, should you believe that this is something that you really want to engage with and learn from, then do please get in touch as well. We're looking to have a series of workshops and activities beyond just the symposium that should be surfacing the issues that we need to think about in this space. This is by no means the definite answer. We're not providing a solution, but what we're doing is questioning those assumptions and thinking about what we need to do and what we need to face in order to conduct the best way of defending and protecting our networks. So at that point, Jake, I'll hand back to you, and hopefully we can have a quick discussion and some questions.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Thanks so much for giving us your incredible talk. Now, the things that jump out to me is the psychological attacks. I've always been interested in the psychology of cybercrime, both through the criminal itself and the victim. And you'll bring it to life with the bigger picture in amongst the whole world with these nation states and cyber war. It brings it all together. And I didn't even realize the power in which that psychological and deception attack has on those businesses. And that's quite something, especially when you look at the human level. Many people think about just the software level of attack. So yeah, great stuff. And I love your sense making questions. I think we ask ourselves every day about what on earth is actually going on. That's quite good. But there are
a lot of the thinking is coming through from the world of law enforcement, and you know, you'll be more aware than me that it's not always necessarily the case that you can have that legal finish. So you need to put disruptive and proactive measures in place, whether it be moving criminal gangs from one area of town to, or dispersing them from different areas, or to be actively or proactively defending vulnerable spots, whether it be in the transport networks and so on, by laying techniques down so that we have that erroneous effect on their sense making. So a lot of these principles are coming straight across in that field.
Great. Actually, you're right. A lot of people say to me, how can we go and get those people? How can we catch those criminal groups? And unfortunately, that's not really that possible. You might even be able to find someone who's maybe done it, but to prove it is something else. So really, you're right. We have to protect ourselves and put that defense in multiple layers to try and defend these companies.
And I think that's what's really interesting with the ransomware groups at the moment. We're seeing quite deliberate and physical actions at the moment. The problem is those physical actions by the FBI and the law enforcement and possibly even the kind of military cyber communities. The problem is that will be against one or two key actors. Until we start getting a situation where the actors believe that there is a likelihood of getting caught and a likelihood of being dealt with and severity in that punishment, then actually they're going to continue anyway. And at the moment, we're having kind of pinprick attacks. We're seeing the first few happening. It's a positive development, but I think that counter-strike mindset is almost back to the deterrence by punishment approach rather than thinking about deterrence by denial, which is about getting them to feel that there's a punishment. Whether or not there actually is a punishment, it doesn't matter, but you can disrupt their thinking and make them believe there's more pain and suffering coming than might otherwise be the case.
Yeah, the changing landscape just goes so quickly. I don't think we can always really keep up to date with it. It's not like the physical threats, like you've said. Those physical threats, you know, if you're being, I don't know, government being ambushed by a group of physical criminals, maybe tanks coming in, sounding like a movie here, but you know, you're going to have the police, the army, everyone on top of it. But cyber attacks, you just haven't got that government help, and so it's so difficult.
I think it's even worse than that, actually. I think, you know, the scenarios if you think of the terrorist example, you might get armed police deploying to Waterloo Station or around key locations in the UK. You might even get the army deployed at Heathrow to protect against that terrorist threat. But in cyberspace, you could be up against the nation state actor. You know, we heard about Sony a few weeks ago, or there were probably associations with the nation state. And not only do you at best have organizations that are working through an information sharing framework, and I'm not being critical of them, that's their role, passing tippers. So you say, actually, I've got to share these tippers so that other people don't get affected. My very competitors might be benefiting from the information I'm sharing whilst I'm getting hammered in a cyber strike that could be being conducted by a nation state actor. And there isn't a military that's going to be stepping up. There isn't a law enforcement. It's not the role of GCHQ. It's not the model that NCSC are following. And to make matters worse, if you do get breached by a hostile state actor, the special forces in the cyber world from Russia or China or somewhere else, if you do get caught and you do get breached, you then have to pay a fine to government for that breach. It does seem as though we've got a slightly frustrating scenario to find ourselves in. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong that we shouldn't be fining people for inappropriate data breaches, but just the whole of package means that you're under the cosh and you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place in both situations. No one's going to be there to protect you, and that wouldn't be the case in the physical world. Yeah,
absolutely right. What a scary point. Right, I've got a couple of questions in here, and if anyone's got any more, please tap away. So firstly, this is a fascinating area, and the idea of going on the attack has a lot of appeal, but what steps can companies take to implement this strategy, and how effective are these tactics?
So I think a great question about the effectiveness. That's what we're working on now, and that's what a lot of people are pushing at now. But I think actually some of these tactics can be employed without you actually having to invest in a large amount of effort. So let's take the burglar alarm on the side of your house. You would all think about having making decisions to put burglar alarms in and you deploying decoy burglar alarms. Have you questioned this effectiveness? Do you know what the effectiveness is there? There is some stats and data that you can be used, so we can bring that across into cyberspace and look at those equivalents there. But likewise, you could do activities that don't necessarily cost very much and could be worth that effort. So rather than necessarily declaring that you're working or you've purchased this particular type of deception tech, that might give the game a little bit, you might choose to form a relationship with a series of organizations that are working in the deception space and actually declaring that you're developing a deceptive strategy. And in that way, just by telling the adversaries in the open source, when they do their recce against you, they're now anticipating things. And there's been lots of stats about individual humans who are very good at anticipating certain deceptive strategies or scams being used against them. It means that they then start anticipating that everywhere, and it slows their progress down, as we saw with the NSA study, and very reliable data and stats. But there's also been some other work showing that if you prime people to look out for things like spear phishing, they become very good at spotting that type of deception, but they become quite weak at spotting other types of deception. So actually, by just being specific or being loose in terms of defining what deception you are, you're getting people to start guessing and start exploring what they could be expecting. And as a result, you're having a beneficial effect. So there's a range of different evidence bodies that we can bring in from different worlds. Even the traditional cybersecurity research work looking at how do we upskill our workforce to not deal with scams and things like that can be turned on its head and applied against our adversaries in that way. So we are building that body of research and body of evidence, but there is also a lot of things that can be done in that initial stage just to turn the tables on the attackers a little bit as well.
Good stuff. Thank you. Well, I've got another question here. How do you see the strategies that you're talking about being adopted over the coming years, and how do you think cyber criminals will adapt their strategy as a consequence? Because we know, of course, that cyber criminals are very good at adapting. We always hear about they are very sophisticated. So, yeah, good question.
Yeah, great question. I think it's going to become a real cat and mouse model, and I don't think we're necessarily seeing that at the moment. We're sort of seeing it from perhaps a digital dimension only, but actually these frailties in decision making, these biases in decision making, we talk about, and I get very frustrated about the talk in cybersecurity about the human being the weakest link, and we've moved on from that a little bit, but we recognize that these biases and frailties in our decision making on a day-to-day basis. So we've not found a way to protect and mitigate those effectively. So I don't think the adversaries will be mitigating and protecting against those effectively at all. This is fundamental human nature that we're exploiting. So as we move into this cat and mouse game, as we're moving into a world which will be much more attritional based on engagement after engagement, deploying assets left, right, and center, we'll be deploying assets, burning them, getting the adversary to be aware of them in certain ways to shape their expectation and understanding. And as they're expecting and understanding it, they'll be then responding differently as well. So I think it will be a really interesting way of moving the defense model forward. So I think we're going to see a much more competitive marketplace of digital intelligence companies providing capabilities, weapons in your golf bag or clubs in your golf bag that you would take out and deploy, and your SOC operators will be making decisions left, right, and center. Your architects will be making decisions left, right, and center to work out how we can redesign, reshape, and deploy into those networks all the time. So I think it'll become a much more agile battlefront.
And with the latest ransomware attacks that we're seeing, with even more eye-watering ransom demands than ever before, I think the latest one yesterday was 240 million from the Revil ransomware group, then they don't always have to change their tactic, because they can just go and simply use ransomware and know, even with the right defenses in place, it's quicker to restore through paying the demands, which is equally scary, I guess.
Well, we're seeing them play on, and we've seen cyber attackers play on our vulnerabilities. It doesn't have to be ransomware. We've seen the scareware, the attacks that don't actually involve you compromising your networks, but telling you that your network's been compromised, and we might have been watching you through your webcam, and we know what you've been looking at, and please pay some ransom here. That's just playing on those very frailties that we've been talking about. Why are we not doing the same to them? We talk about attribution as a geopolitical incident where we get the FBI or the NCSE to declare that the Russians have been involved or the Chinese have been involved in here. Why would we not sow the seeds in our networks, so those attackers operating our networks were seeing information that made them question whether or not we knew who they were and whether that would change what they're doing? How much information would we really need to share from our investigations? Could we not put false TTPs? Every vendor is currently talking about how they can map so many of the MITRE ATT&CK framework with their capabilities. So we have that knowledge of different things. Why could we not seed our networks with different APT indicators of compromise? So it made it look like we were already compromised, so that when the other attacker arrived, they got scared because they were worried about the fact they were on someone else's patch. It's a standard law enforcement technique. We've seen that being used by the police before to disrupt criminal gangs and rival gangs, but we haven't yet done that in cyberspace.
That's a great note to end on, because I know, unfortunately, we're running out of time here. This has been incredible. I'd love to talk about this a hell of a lot more, actually. Hopefully, I get to see you in the real flesh soon, actually. So, but thank you so much, Rob Black. You have been incredibly interesting. I love what you do, and I enjoy watching everything you do from the university there. And thank you to everyone for watching the second part in this webinar series. We've got a few more, like I said earlier, got a few more coming up. The next one is next week, next Thursday. Please check out your emails and log in to that one. And there's another one coming up in December as well. So thank you so much to everyone. But yeah, thanks to Rob Black once more. You've been fantastic, and hopefully we will see you all very soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.